Morrison, 49SAF Pod, coming at you from Amber Bay Loop today, my house. And this is an interview we recorded over a month ago, back in June, and it's with Paul Singh. And Paul Singh is one of the more interesting characters and people you'll meet in venture. The dude lives in an airstream trailer. He lives in a silver trailer, and he lives in over 45 cities a year. And Paul is fundamentally a positive person. I'd encourage you to keep track of Paul on Twitter, at Paul Singh. I'd also encourage you to watch his tech tour. What he does is he goes around, he travels to different communities, he meets the entrepreneurs and startups in these communities. These typically are not venture hubs. They're the quote unquote rest of America that Paul operates in. And he looks to do deals and he looks to invest and he looks to get his message out. And some of that message is that ambition is equally distributed across America. I first met Paul back at the offices of 500 Startups in 2012. He was very early and involved there. He's done a couple VC funds since, and we've kept track of each other. He's a great guy. We do nerd out and talk about risk capital for a long time, kind of from minute 5 to minute 13 and a half. We do talk also about whether money's more important or skills are more important, and whether the entrepreneurs of today kind of need to better develop those skill sets for the modern age. Will you run, say, Google ads over an ad in the local paper, that kind of thing. A pretty wide-ranging interview, a lot of finance talk, a lot of VC talk. So let's get to it. Without further ado, here's Paul Singh. All right. Hey, Paul, you there, man?
I am, yeah. Hey, how's it going there?
It's going pretty good.
Yeah.
We both have pretty interesting schedules. So here in the great state of Alaska, it's 6 a.m. And,
nice.
Nice. We've had 22 hours of light or whatever it is, and just coming off the solstice. So what are you up to? Where are you right now?
So we are in West Yellowstone at the moment, and we're going to be heading up to Missoula, Montana today for another week of the tech tour.
Well, we'll get into that in a second. The first question I've got for you is, just tell me about what your favorite for-profit business is and why.
My favorite for-profit business, man. Well, as an investor, I'm supposed to tell you that I love all my children just the same.
That's the smart play.
Yeah, that's a smart play, I suppose. I don't know. Let's see. So, so a couple that come to mind. Actually, the first one I'll tell you is one that we have not invested in yet. I kind of feel like we're sort of we're begging the founders to close with us or close the money, but they're profitable. But anyway. So we met a company in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, probably about 2 months ago now, and it's run by these two 20-somethings, and they're coders, I guess, by trade. But the really interesting part was when they came in for office hours, they weren't actually pitching for money or anything like that. They had a couple questions about growth and stuff like that. Anyway, here's the point: these two guys sit down and if I remember right, the way the conversation went was, they said something to the extent of, how is it possible that, that karate schools can afford to have like Hummer limos to pick up kids for after school care, but code schools can barely make ends meet. And so, anyway, the point of that is that these guys had really spent the last 2 years building an after school care program, and code camp for kids. And they sort of figured out the model, but their sort of factor was sort of really off the charts. And so, it was cool that they had a great business, but there was something really much more interesting about the way those two founders sort of approached the business. They actually cared about it, and they almost it was this kind of really interesting mix of they genuinely cared about it and they had a chip on their shoulder. And so anyway, that company's called Learn, Build, Create, and it's in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And, that's probably one of them.
Well, that sounds pretty interesting. Part of me thinks we should all be investing in karate camps too.
Well, it's probably not a bad thing. I think the interesting part of all that, though, is that we've run into so many companies that have sort of changed my own perspective over the last year. Prior to driving around everywhere else, I thought I was pretty good about like keeping my eyes open for the last couple of years. So I used to fly a lot for work and finding all these companies and stuff like that. But one of the things that like really opened my eyes over the last year is, as we sort of like lived in these cities for a year at a time, is like just how much the venture capital model or the traditional venture capital model doesn't really match with like what we call Main Street America. When you look at like a company like Learn, Build, Create, they don't, I mean, I guess they could really be a really large company if they wanted to, but, the more you press those founders, the more you find that like their metric of success has nothing to do with, like dollar signs. In fact, it's like the number of kids that they can kind of like help every day. And that maybe sounds a little touchy-feely or whatever, or hand-wavy, but, I think that more of us, I think the whole world would probably be a better place, and we'd all probably make a lot more money, all of us together, if we started to invest in more of these, Main Street businesses, including karate camps.
Yeah. So, I think that this is one of the things that's a growing discussion in the kind of national entrepreneurial support community is how VC is not going to solve everyone's problems. Risk capital models in the rest of America don't work necessarily. So I guess, we're driving all over the map here. Literally, you're West Yellowstone going to Missoula, Montana. We're already talking about what the right kind of financing model is for middle and the rest of America. So let's keep going. How do you do that deal? How do you fund them?
Okay, so the specific answer to that is, I can tell you what we've been doing, and I don't know what everybody else is doing. So, like, what we've been doing is we're using an open source term sheet from another firm called indie.vc. So if you go to indie.vc, indie.vc, and we're not affiliated with them or anything like that, but they had open sourced a really interesting term sheet that basically is a convertible note document. But that allows the company to pay back the capital rather than convert it into equity. So that's what we end up using. And there's some pros and cons to that model, but the way that I sort of describe that term sheet to the founders that we fund is that, hey, look, you've got a business that's getting off the ground here. Using this term sheet allows you to sort of punt the discussion of like whether or not you're going to go venture scale down the road for about 18 months. Because like by the time, like if you read that term sheet, the way it works is that by the time it converts or by the time the note matures, the founder basically has to decide whether they're going to start, a payment schedule back to anybody that invested on that round, on that document, or if they're going to go ahead and convert it to equity. And if they do convert it to equity, it converts just like any other convertible note. So that's sort of the gist, and I can tell you as much or as little as you want to know about it. But again, it's an open source document that we've been using.
No, I think it's an interesting discussion because we get pushback a lot from writing deals, also in the rest of America, where the risk is still off the charts, right? And not necessarily with this particular company, but anytime you're investing in a company where there's just not a lot to back it. There's still a variety of risks. I guess some questions. So the founders determine whether the note converts or not. You don't determine that? So the way it works is there's a couple things that'll convert it. One is that, let's say they do a qualified financing, that will pretty much force the conversion. But other than that, like, again, I'm not a lawyer or anything like that, but generally speaking, the way that I think about it in my head is there's really only two paths there, aside from failure, right? Path number one is the founders decide to raise more money. And I think by default, the qualified financing threshold is $1 million. So if they raise another $1 million, it'll force the conversion of the note. But other than that, like, they're really incentivized to go ahead and pay the note back. And when we write that deal, we're sort of like hoping that they'll take that path. Wow. And what kind of interest rate do you put on it?
It's just like every other standard note. I think the default on there is like 6% maybe.
Wow.
No, but like, the thing is though, that in the venture model, you're never going to make the returns you need off of just interest. So the way that model actually works is, if they really want to like pay back the note, they need to pay principal plus 3x back. So it's not like they're just paying the loan back. They're not, we're not a bank or something like that, right? So let's say you raised $250,000 on this note and you don't want it to convert. Well, then you've got to start a payment plan that pays that principal plus 3x back, ideally within 3 years. So it's not cheap money by any means, but the fact that you're raising on that note probably means that you're not ready for bank financing, or maybe you don't want to even deal with like the traditional venture model.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I'd have to whip out a spreadsheet. So really, it's not necessarily a 6% interest rate. You're getting your X. You're getting your X in the sheet on the note side, right?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
With the big understanding that this is assuming they can afford to pay that back, right? I mean, like I kind of feel like so there's like a couple of risks of this model, right? Risk number one is the obvious one, which is that the company fails, and if the company fails, then nobody's getting paid back anything, right?
Uh-huh.
The scarier, or the other risk, and I should say arguably the scarier risk, is that they do decide to raise more money and force the conversion. And if they do that, like, we can't even be mad about it. But then at that point, we're kind of stuck on the cap table with any other investors that are on there, right? And that, as you know, that could still fail, or it could take like 7 or 8 years for it to work out. So we're sort of like hoping, and I only hesitate because, this is going to make me sound like a terrible person here, but like, we're hoping that like we're investing in these like super greedy people that are building a business that's focused on making money and that they don't want us to convert, right? So like, we want them to be incentivized to pay back or begin the payment schedule as fast as they can. So like, I don't know if this is like the perfect model, but I just know that, on the one hand, we can't just be investing in these quote unquote venture scale companies all the time. And on the other hand, like, this asset class has to return 20% internal or 20% IRR, or 3x, net cash at least every 5 to 7 years. And so like, we've got to find ways to do that. And I don't know how else to do it. So anyway, this Indy.VC term sheet so far, at least for the last year, has been a really interesting model.
Okay. Have you ever played around with royalty or revenue structures in your deals?
I have not, no. And that's mostly because I just don't know how to do that. Not necessarily that it's like a bad thing or anything like that. I mean, in fact, you could argue that like the Indy.VC model is sort of close to that, but we've never done anything like, I've seen some term sheets in the past where people have done stuff right off of royalties and stuff like that. I just don't know how to do that.
Yeah, I got a little exposed to it fairly recently at a conference, and I haven't dived into it. But for me, I think the thing that's important that you're following here, Paul, and sort of helping lead the way on is like, you have a right of presentment and you have a way to get out of the deal. And you can still go down the equity path if it's appropriate, right? Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, like, the hardest part of that kind of investing, by the way, at least from what I've learned over the last year, has been sort of what I would loosely call the underwriting process. Because like this deal, I mean, as you're kind of like putting it, even as I try to like ramble it out to you or whatever, like I said, the risk of this thing is on the one hand that they fail, and on the other hand that they decide to convert into equity. And so like the thing here is, the real risk here is underwriting, if you will, because you essentially need companies that have at least 6 months of revenue, even if it's just tiny, right? Like one of the deals that we did this term sheet on was a company that I think barely had $4,000 a month in revenue at the time. And it's super risky because they might, a year from now say, hey, look, we're still not in the black and we're going to have to, raise more venture. And that's a risk that we kind of understood. But the point is that like, the biggest risk here is that underwriting of the companies themselves. Yeah, no, absolutely. The risk is still the same. It might not be quite as
that's
off.
fair.
Yeah, it might not be quite as off the charts as it is in a venture hub, but the risk is still the same because it's an early stage firm, right?
Yeah, that's right.
All right. So we've nerded out on matters of risk capital and finance. Let's talk about what you're doing, because I don't think everybody knows. So tell us about the tour. Tell us about year 2. Sort of give us the genesis of this and what you're up to.
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm going to go on a quick aside real quick, because you said something a minute ago that made me want to say this, and so you edit it out if you think this is terrible. But so you mentioned something earlier about how, and I'm paraphrasing here, so I'm going to put words in your mouth, but you mentioned something earlier about how people seem to think sometimes that venture capital, or just broadly speaking, that some sort of money is what's going to fix these like entrepreneurial communities around the country. And I think like one of the things that I've sort of learned over the last year is that it's actually a lack of skills or lack of skills training that's holding people back. So in other words, like ambition is pretty equally distributed across North America, right? I mean, like everywhere you go, it doesn't matter big city or small city. If you just talk to somebody in the supermarket or at the coffee shop or whatever, you'll find very quickly that ambition is very equally distributed across the country. Now, most people will then say, like, hey, boy, if only we had another venture firm or some more money available in each of these towns. Boy, if only we had that, like, there would be more entrepreneurs. And the thing I've learned is that that's just not true. I mean, there's just, the reality is that money sort of follows skills, not the other way around. So I think one of the things we really got to be thinking about, and then I'll stop after this, but like, I just think that, right now, we're not really teaching our kids the tools they need to succeed in today's sort of environment. And I say that in a very broad and general way, but I really mean it. And then I think the other thing is we don't really have a lot of clean pathways for adults in this country to transition jobs either, right? Like if you're a 37-year-old cab driver in Taos, New Mexico, and, you want to learn how to code or, whatever, boy, like that's not very easy, So anyway, I'll just leave it at that and just say that I think it's the I think skills is what we could be improving on. Entrepreneurial skills is what we could be improving on, instead of like worrying about how to bring more venture capital everywhere else. But sort of like going back to like what I'm doing. So I live in a 30-foot Airstream travel trailer. And
all the time, or just during a certain part of the year?
I'd say about 80% of the year. So
okay.
we have so Dana and I, so let me step back. Context is important here. So, when I first started investing in companies, our super secret strategy, and you can't tell anybody this, but the super secret strategy was, I was living in the DC area at the time in 2009, and, Washington Dulles Airport, which is like our big airport there, is a United Airlines hub. So this is my super secret strategy. You can't tell anybody. Basically, I would get on the cheapest flight every Monday and go wherever that cheap flight would go, and then just try to find companies to invest in. So sometimes you'd end up in Chicago, and sometimes you ended up in Orlando, and sometimes you ended up in New Delhi. But that's what we did for 5 or 6 years. So from 2009 to 2015, I was flying about 250,000 miles, just going everywhere and investing in companies. And it was fun, but it was grueling. And for anybody listening that's done any sort of business travel, you kind of know that like the charm of business travel wears off after about the first week, because you're doing laundry in random hotels every week or whatever. So, all right. So now it's the end of 2015. I've been sitting on airplanes for years, and we've got this portfolio everywhere. But the thing that I started to think a lot about was, okay, so personally and professionally. Personally, Dana and I didn't get to spend any time together, so that was that, and that was terrible. We wanted to fix that. And then professionally, the thing we sort of noticed was that all these big cities. So, if you follow my sort of idea of just jumping on these airplanes and going wherever they go, what you learn is they usually just stop in big cities. So, for example, United will fly to Denver or Phoenix or Chicago or Orlando or Miami. These are relatively big cities, right? But if you really want to like get a little further away from those hubs, air travel specifically gets a little bit trickier. So we decided to buy an Airstream travel trailer, and so we downsized everything that we had in DC. Frankly, I think we have a super small apartment. We kind of joked that our trailer is bigger than our apartment in DC now. It's just really there for mail right now. But for about 80% of the year, we live full time in this trailer, and we just try to go to these places that, are a little harder to get to. So for example, even here in West Yellowstone, it's like hanging out at the local coffee shops and just trying to get to know what people are working on. And that sounds creepy, but in this town, there's really no co-working space. So I can't just go walk up to the co-working space and say, hey, who's working on cool stuff, So anyway, we live in this Airstream. We've done about 41,000 miles since we left Washington, D.C. last March. We've lived in, I think, now 60 cities for about 4 or 5 days at a time now. And we're investing along the way and just trying to meet as many people as we can. And it's me, Dana, and the dog just living in this trailer.
Well, let's take last year as your sample size. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is illustrated for kind of doing deals elsewhere in America or doing deals in the rest of America. How many deals did you look at, and how many deals would you have written? I know that you probably had a capacity issue, I think you said.
Yeah.
But give me the percentage.
Okay, so I don't know how many we met. I can go back on the spreadsheets and look that up for you. But let's just do napkin math here for a second. So right off the top of my head, I know that when we were we were on the road for something like 40 some weeks last year, and we lived in, I think, 44 or 45 cities, I think, last year. And across those cities, we had about 30,000 people check in, physically, physically come to the events that we put on in each of these cities. Now, the thing is, though, is that we whittle that down to probably about 25 or 30 startups that we sit down with for 30-minute meetings in each city. So whatever that is. So let's just say 45 cities times 30, easy math. So what is that, 1,200-ish companies or something like that? So
let's go.
Companies is probably a strong word for some of these. But anyway, so we're sitting down with about 1,200 of these companies, and I think we whittled them down to about 50-ish in actual investments. And I think it'll probably end up being 47 or 50, somewhere in there. I'd have to go back and look at the dates. Because, for example, some of the deals in December would have spilled over to January, and then the question is, how do you actually count them? But anyway, so that's sort of the high level. Now, one of the things there is that we didn't really learn about the Main Street investing idea until about halfway through the year, so I think that number could have been a little bit higher. I think the truth of it, though, is that the capacity issue was less on our end. Certainly there is always capacity issues, but I think we could have done more had we thought about the Main Street investing sooner. I think the bigger issue, believe it or not, was convincing other investors to co-invest with us. I think there's still a lot of preconceived notions externally about where great companies start. And I think, so there's two kinds of investors you have to convince into every deal. There's the local ones and then the ones that are far away. The far away ones tend to still have this internal concern about where great companies can start. And then the local ones, they're sometimes a little skeptical. They're for example, in the upper Midwest, you have a lot of farmers, right? Really smart people that have made a lot of wealth by farming, right? Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden you're trying to do a deal with a company that makes something that they can't touch. And so they're naturally skeptical. And so that, I think that convincing other people to join us on the, in these deals turned out to be the hardest part last year.
And, were you always in with other people?
We've never been alone in a deal, but it's not uncommon that we're the first money in, and then we have to spend the next 90 days, helping them corral other people.
Yeah. So what do you want out of this year?
When I think about this, it's okay, what is the next what does a new version of a venture firm look like that not only can handle these Main Street deals, like, so we've been kind of talking about raising. I only hesitate because I can't like say the fundraising stuff publicly, but the thing is that what if there was a new venture fund where at least half the money was allocated towards these Main Street type of investments, and what if this venture fund actually, I don't know that I can kind of keep doing this. This is not a sustainable lifestyle, I don't think. Not at this pace anyway, forever. So, but what if this new kind of fund also had like 5 or 6 investing venture partners spread out geographically throughout the U.S.? So in other words, like, you know, I might be going back to D.C. to be closer to family after this trip's all done, but like, we can still run that fund centrally. And what if there was an investing partner in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Lubbock, Texas, you know, Anchorage, Alaska, and all these people, you know, are investing out of this centralized fund? That's kind of what I think a lot about, right? Is it, you know, that's kind of a half-baked thought right now, but it's like, how do you decentralize venture capital a little bit while also sort of finding other ways to generate the return rather than just betting on venture scale companies? Like, that's the foolish part here, I think, is that, like, you know, if you look at the United States today, there's 600 plus venture firms now throughout the U.S., and they're all hunting for unicorns. And that just, I mean, you can do the math. That doesn't work. And so I think the next thing that we have to do here is really think about, like, how do we institutionalize what we've been doing with our own money over the last year? And so I think we've got enough historical data now to sort of like to really start to do that. And so anyway, that's my kind of rambly hope, is that we sort of figure out how to institutionalize what we've been doing over the last year.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people talk about how it's, you know, the irony of venture is, right, it's capital that goes into innovation, but the capital model hasn't really been innovated.
Correct. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and you know, it's interesting because it's like, it's perfectly rational behavior on the part of the investor. Like if you really think about it, like, you know, what you just said there about like how, you know, the irony is that we're investing money in people, but we're not investing, like, we're not changing ourselves or innovating ourselves. Like, if you think about like how humans operate, all humans are incentivized. Like, if you really want to understand why people make the decisions they do, ask them how they're incentivized, or try to figure out how they're incentivized. You know, like if you're sitting at a big venture fund in Palo Alto right now, you know, you're getting paid a management fee of the money you've got. There's very little incentive for you to innovate, right? Because like you know, why screw up that 2% revenue stream you've got or income stream you've got? Because like in your world, everything's just fine. And by the time everything changes, you know, you'll be retired anyway. And so like, that doesn't make them bad people. But I think what that really means is it's not going to be somebody from one of the coasts that figures out like how to do this internally. Like, I think it's like everywhere else. I think it's going to be like operators and local investors that sort of like rise up and sort of fill the gaps between the coasts. Does that sort of make sense?
No, it makes sense. Look, I think your hub and spoke idea is really interesting. People have struggled with a long time for why, you know, risk capital only happens in the backyard.
Yeah.
And you know, I know you've struggled in the past with like, why can't we better take a quantified approach to this, right?
Yeah.
Like that was your mission for a while.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So innovation's needed for sure if we want to fund more of these companies. You know, I've got this theory and the theory goes a little something like, you know, why is American entrepreneurship on such a steep decline? Yeah. I think it could be that finance has gotten so professionalized that, you know, of course, everybody realizes how risky early stage companies are. But I'm making a lot of assumptions here. Back in the 60s and the 70s, maybe even into the early 80s, you know, you could get a loan for your small business that was largely unproven from a bank or from local people who wanted to invest in it. And you know, now we've professionalized that, and we've got a bunch of models, and and things, and banks intelligently are as far away from that as they can be often. But, that access to capital might be constraining things. I don't know.
Yep. I mean, like, I think that's, like, I know nothing that allows me to disagree with you at all. I think that, like, ultimately, though, I think it's now easier than ever to start a company from wherever you're at. And if that's true, then I think the biggest barrier to, like, the next generation of entrepreneurship is really just the people themselves. But it's not because they're probably not ambitious. I think it's probably because of, like, lack of skills training. Okay, so if we're just kind of brainstorming here for a minute, like, I just happened to be in Lima, Peru not last year, I'm sorry, 2 weeks ago. And so the point is that I was just sitting there and I was watching all these people.
I'm sorry, that's a great conversation. I think it was last year. No, it was 2 weeks ago.
That's right. That tells you, like, what I think about time these days. But the thing is, though, that I was watching all these people that were working real hard, right? Like, there's a lot of, like, what we describe as blue collar jobs that happen to be the majority of local sector jobs, right? Like, whether it's somebody selling trinkets on the side of the road or whatever. And I was just thinking, like, man, like, if I had an extra $100K right now, and I'm just making this up, right? So I'm going to throw a couple companies under the bus, but only because they're not here to defend themselves. But, like, man, if I had $100K or something like that I could blow right now, I'd be like, okay, let's go get Etsy or Shopify to do, like, a quarterly, training series in Lima to show some of these people that are selling trinkets on the side of the road how to create an online store. And in the worst case, some of those people then learn, new computer skills that they might not have already had. And in the best case, maybe some of them get a little bit bigger. Maybe they get a little bit more sales than they would have just by, like, standing on the side of the road or whatever. Like, and I think that if you agree with that idea, I think that sort of translates to what I mean by, like, a lack of skills training, even here in the U.S. Like where I grew up was in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and so Virginia, I imagine, just like a lot of other states, has these, like, SBDC, small business development centers, and at least in my state, a lot of them have to do with business plans and stuff like that. But the reality is that, like if you're the kind of people that go in there right now tend to be somebody that, like, just didn't even Google anything, and, like, I would just argue that, like, the value of, like, a business plan is just kind of almost zero at the moment. The point is that maybe some of these SBDCs should be teaching more relevant skills. Like, if you're a bricklayer, we should be at least telling you how to look at Google Ads as opposed to just, here's how you do a newspaper ad. Or if you're I don't know, I'm just making this up, right? But it's like, I don't know, if you're like a marketing consultant or whatever, and you're living in a small town in rural Virginia or whatever, like let's teach you how Twitter and Facebook ads and everything else work. And that's not because like that's, like, the only thing you should be betting your future on. But, if you're a marketing consultant in a rural town in Virginia, like right now, you're probably still telling people, well, here's how you advertise in the local paper. And then you're wondering why nobody wants to, like, buy your service or whatever. And so, I don't know, I imagine 5 years from now, there's going to be some academic term for what you and I are talking about here. But like right now, I just feel like a guy living in a trailer, and I'm just seeing all this stuff about, all these smart people that just, I think, would benefit from just a little bit more training. And then the money will come after that. I mean, I think venture capital has always chased deals. I mean, that's just how it works. It's always chase deals.
Yeah, I think so. That is a conversation we're having in our community, which is that there needs to be technical assistance as well as financial assistance for early stage companies. Assistance isn't necessarily the right term, but a resource, right?
Yeah.
And to be fair to the SBDC, we work with them pretty closely, and some of them are changing to support kind of the quote unquote new entrepreneurship across the country. It's hard, it's a federal division, I think, of the Small Business Administration, kind of structured differently in each state. But, I would agree that technical assistance to entrepreneurs and making sure the right financial resources that we talked about at the start of the show is there for entrepreneurs is something that is continuing to develop across the country. All right, man. Final thoughts on your way out. I've taken up way more of your time than I intended to. Final thought?
Look, I just, I don't know about final thoughts. I guess I would just say, like, look, if you have an idea in the back of your head and you're listening to this right now, I think the challenge I would make to everybody is just figure out how to make $1,000 off of that within 30 days. And I know that sounds ridiculous or whatever, but I think two things. I think number one, I think, a lot of the conversations that I've seen around the country over the last year have been around this idea of like, boy, how do we help create the next Google from small town New Mexico or small town Montana or whatever. And I think that's the wrong conversation. I think the question we should be asking ourselves, like from an economic development standpoint, is, are we better off having one potential Google in the next 5 years in your small town, or are we better off having 50,000 of your citizens making an extra $1,000 a month? And I know that sounds kind of weird, but just think about that for a moment. But again, the second part of this is, again, the second part for everybody is, if you've got an idea in the back of your head, don't overthink it. I mean, entrepreneurship is really about brute force, not elegance. But my challenge to everybody listening would be, take whatever you've got and turn it into $1,000 within the next 30 days. And if you can do that, I think people like me can help you figure out how to get it to 10,000 or more if that's what you want to do. So just get to 1,000. That's all you got to do.
All right, everybody, go make $12,000 extra this year. With Paul Singh from Yellowstone, this is Joe Morrison on Amber Bay Loop in Anchorage, Alaska, signing off from the 49SAF pod, where, yes, the music of One Direction plays far too frequently. Thanks for listening, everybody. All right, man. Good time.
Awesome, man. Thanks for the time, and I'll talk to you soon.